Namaste and welcome to Urban Chatterati. This is Abhinav Prakash. And today I am joined by Vikram Sampath to discuss his latest book, the second part of biography of Veer Savarkar. Vikram, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Abhinav.
Vikram, we hope that you are fine. Your health has recovered to a large extent. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, getting better. I think the Chinese virus, its impact lasts a lot longer than we, expected. But yeah, much better than the nightmare that it was in April and May. Yeah, thank you.
By the way, congratulations on this second part of the book. It's like, hey, great. I'm going through it, but it's a very interesting biography. And Vikram, I keep saying that Savarkar was the most consequential Hindu in Hindu political history after Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. Hindu political history changed after Shivaji Maharaj. And then the impact of Savarkar is also immense. It changed the direction of the Hindu polity. Do you agree to that?
That's a wonderful way to, connect Savarkar also with someone he eulogized all his life, and that was Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, and who was a childhood inspiration for him too. He was among the few people, very few people would know even the Shivaji Aarti that is written was actually composed by Savarkar as a student, young student. So both of them, and particularly Savarkar, right till the end of his life, the use of history as a tool to create that sense of awareness, that sense of identity, that sense of pride in your nation, whether it was his 1857 book, The First War of Indian Independence, or the last book that he wrote, The Six Golden Epochs of Indian History, which again was, highlighting the aspect that we as a nation were not one of losers alone. We also pushed back. There was resistance. So in all of this, when we say Hindu leader, I don't know how much of it can be associated with the religion per se, because he himself was a Nirishwarvadi, deeply philosophical, drew a lot of inspiration from the, Hindu philosophical texts. Even in the cellular jail, as we know, he was constantly inspired by Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and so on, but not someone who was ritualistic, someone who was completely against caste, but the proponent of the Hindutva ideology, someone who gave it a concrete structure and name, though the name Hindutva, as we know, has been in vogue for a very long time, right from the 1890s when it was first used, but then giving it a structure, a formula, so to say, as to who is a Hindu culturally and nationally, and consolidation of the fragmented Hindu society, both to eliminate caste differences completely, and also create a politically conscious, consolidated Hindu vote bank, so to say, or a society where, as a perfect answer to the political Islam that was raising its heads then, and also threatening to, and later also succeeding in vivisecting the subcontinent completely on communal lines. So to that extent, yes, an ideologue whose thoughts, views, philosophies, and ideas hold a lot of relevance even today, particularly when parties bearing allegiance to Hindutva are in the political ascendant in India today.
And this is very important because, Savarkar was the first Hindu to give a systematic political response to imperialism. His Hindutva, and I say Hindutva is Hindu political response to political Islam and Western imperialism. What was the vision of Savarkar for a future India? Let me also add, what Savarkar saw, what he tried to reform, and where he wanted to go.
Yeah, I'd probably read, a little bit of his own. I mean, instead of me paraphrasing, what he must have thought of India of the future. This was 1 year before his death in 1966. So I think not even 1 year, a couple of months during Diwali of 1965, he gave a very extensive, the last interview to the organizer, the RSS mouthpiece. And so I've quoted that entire, interview where one question that is asked of him, and I think that answers your question completely. What is the India of your dreams? He was asked. And he says this, and I quote, "My India would be a democratic state in which people belonging to different religions, sects, or races would be treated with perfect equality. None would be allowed to dominate others. none would be deprived of his just and equal rights of free citizenship, so long as everyone discharged the common obligation which he owed to the state as a whole. Hindustan, the motherland and the holy land of the Hindus, from the Indus to the seas, would be an organic, undivided state. The Hindus would be a casteless society, a consolidated and a modern nation. Science and technology would be encouraged. There would be a total liquidation of landlordism. All the land would belong to the state eventually. All key industries would be nationalized. India would be self-sufficient in respect of food, clothes, shelter, and defense. The India of my dreams would have unbounded faith in a world commonwealth, because the earth is the common motherland of all. But India would not go down under the evolution of this world commonwealth. The foreign policy of a militarily strong Akhand Hindustan would be a polity of neutrality and peace. And a powerful centralized state of Hindustan would contribute very effectively towards an enduring peace and prosperity in the world. Unquote. So in just this very short...
I'm hearing it for the first time ever.
Yes. So in this little paragraph said a few months before his death, I think he summarizes everything about his, belief in democracy, in secularism, in military strength, in, a peaceful existence in the Committee of Nations without giving up India's self-interest, which was always his motto, that Indian interest first, nation first, and calling for this, social harmony among people of all religions, and a complete, as he said, complete casteless society as the ideal to work towards. Science, technology, modernism, progressiveness. So I think instead of me putting words and trying to summarize, I thought it's best I pass on the mic to the man himself so that he can say what he thought a few months before he died.
And this is very important, because we read so much about Savarkar in different articles by eminent historians and so on. We never read these things. We only read some random statements and then the entire narrative built around it. Yeah. The Hindu Mahasabha has been painted as the counterpart to Muslim League. But if you read the manifesto of Hindu Mahasabha, that is also calling for a secular state. Yeah. But the Muslim League was calling for that the vote of a Hindu should be one-third in value of the vote of a Muslim. Then why this demonization of Savarkar? Why exactly? You also write something that there was one person who used to go to Savarkar's story sessions during his childhood. He got a very high rank in the civil service examination after independence. But he was then given postal service because police report says that he's influenced by Savarkar.
True.
Why such fear and demonization of Savarkar?
That's again a very valid question, Abhinav, and I think the answer lies in the fact that two things. I think one is his association with Hindutva, and anybody. You can speak on behalf of any other community, then it's okay. But then anybody who speaks on behalf of the Hindu community and its voice, they get dubbed as communal, and so that continues to this date. And so that was one of the reasons why I think he was demonized so much. The other one was, of course, his alleged association with Mahatma Gandhi's murder, of which, of course, the highest court of the country itself honorably exonerated him, not once, but several times, 2 times, as recent as 2018, which also I mentioned in the book. There was a review petition, a public interest litigation filed, and on the basis of which he was acquitted. But in the immediate years following India's independence, and particularly after Mahatma Gandhi's death, the manner in which political opponents were all shown their place by the ruling dispensation to ensure that there is a complete hegemonic control of the Congress party, the government, is something that very few people ponder about. Everyone, Netaji was eliminated, and then we still our friends like Anuj Dhar and Chandrachud Ghosh are still trying to figure out the mystery behind what happened. Did he come back? Gumnami Baba and all of that. Ambedkar was sidelined increasingly. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee's unfortunate death under mysterious circumstances in Kashmir. And Sardar Patel. Sorry?
Murder of Deen Dayal Upadhyay.
Yes, murder of Deen Dayal Upadhyay ji, and Sardar Patel too being constantly demonized and with insinuations, especially after Gandhi's murder, that as the Home Minister he had probably failed in his duty and all of that. And Savarkar, who was coming up as one of the very promising counter voices to the government, so a very important leader of the opposition, implicated in a murder that would taint his reputation forever. And so that's why any kind of association with him, even by a long measure, would lead to social ostracization. People would lose their livelihoods, their jobs. So the more you probably wrote disparagingly about him, even without consulting some of the documents or even without reading his writings, the more you would be actually awarded for it. So I think that becomes a casualty where not only history, but also it's very tragic that a man like him, who had contributed so much for the country, has to still constantly be in the glare of accusations, ridicule, whether it's in election rallies or even on social media or anywhere else, by people who really don't care too much to read between the nuances of history. You did mention about the Hindu Mahasabha being in its manifesto. In the course of this book, research of this book, I came across this wonderful document called the Constitution of Free Hindustan State, which the Hindu Mahasabha had actually drafted in 1945. There was a committee that was composed of Bhopatkar, L.B. Bhopatkar, K.V. Kelkar, D.B. Gokhale, and M.R. Dhamdhare. And they came up with this document, a 95-page document, which has striking similarities to the final Constitution of India in terms of, who is a citizen, what are the fundamental rights, about 16 fundamental rights that were listed for an Indian citizen, the role of the judiciary, the executive, the legislature, the powers of the President of India, the Prime Minister of India, the cabinet, everything laid out. And among these 16, fundamental rights, I'd like to again read out that, and this was 1945, mind you, 2 years before freedom and 5 years before the actual constitution came into being. It says, and I quote, that with no distinction of religion, caste, creed, and gender, all Indians born here or with parents born here and domiciled for not less than 7 years were to be citizens of the country. Freedom of conscience and the free profession and practice of religion and the protection of culture and language are subject to public order and morality guaranteed to every citizen. And no law shall be made either directly or indirectly to endow any religion or prohibit or restrict the free exercise thereof or give any extra preference or impose any disability on account of religious beliefs or religious status. It also laid out that no person attending any school receiving state aid or other public money shall be compelled to attend religious instructions that may be given in the school. There shall be no state religion in free Hindustan or its provinces. What else is secularism in the true sense of the term, being propounded by what is probably today dubbed as the most ultra right-wing Hindu nationalist party? Even they were standing.
No longer the nationalist, fringe militant group, fascist,
all of
Nazi
that.
avatar of Indian political spectrum and whatnot.
So yeah, this was the definition of Hindu Rashtra, where in that Hindu Rashtra that was envisaged, everybody was free to do what they want. And this was a policy document of the party of 1945. But right from 1937, in his speeches as the president of the Hindu Mahasabha, Savarkar always said that the same things in different ways, that the majority will not get any extra privileges only because they are more in number. And on the converse, the minorities will not get extra concessions just because they are a minority. And everybody is going to be treated equally in the eyes of the law. The minorities, he says, should not even have a ghost of suspicion in their mind that the Hindu Rashtra will do anything to infringe upon their legitimate religious, cultural, political, or linguistic rights. And if at all somebody infringes that, then the Hindu Rashtra will ensure that these infringements are removed. So despite all this, as you said rightly, nobody reads all this. You have an agenda to drive, and then you want to keep repeating a lie so many times without any corroborative evidence. Then, it starts gaining ground as the dominant narrative.
Yeah, but you said something very important. Savarkar is using the word Hindu Rashtra, Hindu nation. His document is not envisioning a Hindu state.
Yeah.
And Hindu state has never been the point of debate in the Hindutva movement.
Yeah.
I have not come across Hindutva movement talking about a Hindu state. They're talking about a Hindu nation, which they say already exists. What was the Savarkar's opinion on this particular topic, especially when confronted with the social orthodoxy, like Ramaraja Parishad and other people who wanted to create a society run by Shastras and a kind of a theocratic version of Hindu society?
Oh, completely opposed to that. I mean, in his Hindutva treatise also begins with the premise that I have nothing. This philosophy has nothing to do with the theological aspects of Hinduism, and he writes extensively also that all the preponderance of the religion, of philosophical or metaphysics of the soul, the super soul, the journey of the soul, salvation, all these are very, very esoteric preoccupations for saints and sages and people who are interested in religion. We are concerned only with as we mentioned earlier, the political consolidation and giving that political response at a time when the Hindus were being taken for a ride, following the Khilafat movement, following the communal award, following right from the Lucknow Pact of 1916 onwards, the series of concessions that were being given, particularly to the Muslim community of India. And a danger which was actually envisaged not only by Savarkar but even by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, that nobody really points out today or quotes Dr. Ambedkar on what his views were on this. So religion for him played a very subservient role. Even in his speeches in the Hindu Mahasabha, he says civilizational unity, where India of 1950, it was born as, we think it was born in 47 or 50, but then we are a civilization which is 5,000 or more than that years old. So the civilizational unity, this cultural nationalism was far important to him than mere territorial integrity or territorial patriotism. So his nationalism had a more far, reaching expanse of cultural, civilizational unity, rather than just sticking to the borders and territory, which was also equally important because, mind you, the Hindu Mahasabha was the only political front in the country, which till the very end, when it was almost a no-brainer that the country was going to get partitioned, in May 1947, till then, they were actually protesting against the partition of the country. Even the Congress was willing to accept everything, including the Cripps mission, which called for almost a complete dismemberment of India, and we would have had a larger Pakistan than what actually came up, because every princely state was allowed to, or every province was allowed to go to any of the units or form their own independent subunits. And the Congress was ready to play ball to that in return for getting the defense ministry. And it was almost certain in all the newspapers in India and abroad that Jawaharlal Nehru is going to become the first defense minister of India in 1942. But then finally Gandhi actually put his foot down.
Was going to be the prime minister then?
No, it was still under the viceroy. So it was an interim government. So the viceroy, of course, was the supreme this thing. But then matters like defense and finance and all that was kept with the British, even in the Viceroy Council.
So the champion of peace wanted defense ministry, you were saying?
I'm not so sure how much Nehru was a champion of peace, because I think he had his differences with Gandhiji also on that. But Gandhiji himself, I mean, in 1942, we talk of the Quit India movement. He had said that, British quit India, but leave your army behind, and this was something that had alarmed someone as close to Gandhiji as Rajgopalachari, who had said that this would be British imperialism in its worst form, because you take away the civil power, you leave the army, and India could happily be the military base for American and British troops to fight the Second World War in Asia against Japan and all of that, and China. So we would have just been a huge landmass of a military base. And so that was also the idea of someone like Gandhi, who all the time said, we stand for non-violence. So I think it's a very, very complicated situation.
But you mentioned Ambedkar, and Ambedkar also envisioned in India, which he called Prabuddha Bharat, an enlightened India, in which he says the equality of women, the social equality, the universal access to democratic rights, liberty, and so on. Those were the pillars of Ambedkar's Prabuddha India. How much Savarkar's view and Ambedkar's view converge?
I think to a very, very large extent. And that's one, because both of them were, I think, looking for a complete dismantling of the caste system. And whether rightly or wrongly, I'm not going to judge that. Both of them thought that the Varna system was at the root cause of the whole concept of the caste. The Varnas, the four Varnas gave rise to so many jatis and upajatis, which, so if you have to cut the poisonous tree, according to them, you had to remove it from the roots. And for them, they thought that the Varna was there. And Gandhi was completely opposed to that. He said, I believe in the Varna system. I think that is the bedrock of Hinduism. And once that is shaken, Hinduism will collapse and all of that. So in fact, Ambedkar writes also laudatory letters to Savarkar, and I've quoted them in the book, where he says, you're the only one who has understood this concept that the Varna needs to, go for the caste system to go. You can't have piecemeal reforms of Harijan Uddhar or untouchability eradication until the root cause of this cancer is detected. And so in the 13 years that Savarkar was confined to Ratnagiri and was not allowed to take part in politics, the social laboratory, the laboratory for social reforms that Ratnagiri was made into by him is again a chapter of our history which we don't refer to. Hindutva always associated with Manuvad, upper caste hegemony, all these labels we have today. That is what is blindly attributed to even him. I mean, that he was a believer in the Manusmriti.
What were those social experiments, if you can briefly talk about them?
Several of them. I mean, it stemmed from his writings of those 7 shackles, which held the Hindu society. Vedokta Bandi, where he thought the Vedas were not the preserve only of the Brahmin community. It was universal knowledge. And so it had to be universalized to all communities. And so if wearing a sacred thread or getting the Gayatri Mantra Upadesh was the barrier, he used to conduct mass, Upanayans for members of all castes, including the so-called lower castes. Then Vyavasai Bandi, where he said, the profession you have is not based on merit, not based on heredity, but it's based on merit. You are not born into a profession, but you work towards it. Again, very different from what Gandhiji said, where everybody cannot become a prime minister or a viceroy. You need to be born with some leadership traits and genes, which is again, I think, very, very different to what a democracy today is, where a chaiwala can become a prime minister. Then, Sparsha Bandi, removal of Sparsha Bandi or untouchability, Shuddhi Bandi, those who are coming back to, the Hindu fold, the Ghar Vapsi, allowing that because there was no way, we are not a proselytizing faith. So have this mechanism to bring those who want to return to the parent faith. Samudra Bandi, where crossing of the seas was allowed and it didn't lead to loss of caste. And Roti Bandi and Beti Bandi, intercaste dining, intercaste marriage. So all of this, including, they would work so hard, go into the Maharvadas in Ratnagiri, win their trust, because there was a lot of distrust even from the so-called lower caste about this Chitpavan Brahmin and his associates coming into their locality. So several years of coaxing them, cajoling them, starting an Asprishya Ganpati, an untouchable Ganpati, where members of all communities would go and worship that, building on what Bal Gangadhar Tilak had used the Ganpati ideology, the iconoclastic symbol to kind of create nationalistic feeling. Then also opening up schools for members of all castes, again a first probably in India, where it was in Ratnagiri that though the government circulars were there that on paper they wanted everybody to all the children to sit together and study in a school classroom, it was never followed by the government, British government. So he championed that, fought so hard for that, and ensured that came to fruition. Seh Bhojan, the dining among people of all castes, which was again a very, very hard won fight at a time in Maharashtra where even among the Brahmins, the Chitpavans and the Deshasthas would not sit together and eat with each other. And probably even now all those things exist in some corner of this country. So in that time, so much of social ostracism, so much of pushback from the orthodoxy. People used to pelt stones at him and his associates. But then he went on with the task, including opening the first temple in India, the Patit Pavan Mandir in 1931 for members of all castes. He tried this temple entry. Again, Ambedkar was doing the same around that time, the Mahad Satyagraha, or the entry into temples, the use of waters of wells and tanks for people of all castes. So similar projects which he managed in in Ratnagiri successfully also. He tried it in other parts like Nashik, the Ram Mandir there and so on, but then he could not. But then there's that very, emotional poem that he also composed, which I think Atalji also, referred to in one of his speeches, that, after so many years of struggle and coaxing the temple authorities and so on, all the communities, all of them, they ascend the steps of the temple and try to have a darshan of the Lord. And they're all singing this song that Savarkar composed, that don't prevent me from seeing my creator, remove these false barriers between me and my maker, and let us all together as Hindus ascend these steps and push back or leave behind generations of oppression behind us. So it was a very moving moment where those who saw that said people were literally having tears streaming down their cheeks as they sang this and went up the steps of that temple to finally gain entry. So I don't know, a prototype of social reforms of the father of Hindutva, which is a very, the father of Hindutva being a firebrand revolutionary and a firebrand social reformer, I think strips off two very important beating sticks of the Marxists, because both these ideas have been, they've been taken away by them, appropriated by them, that revolutionary means you have to be a Marxist, social reformer means you have to be a Marxist, whereas both of that was not true. Ambedkar himself was so much against communism.
Yeah. So if you see when the Mahat Satyagraha was happening, if I'm not wrong, Gandhi denounced it, saying that it's not Satyagraha, it's Duragraha, whereas Savarkar did support it.
Yes.
Right? And also the Pune Pact, when it was signed, Savarkar is one of the signatories, which basically provides for representation to the depressed classes, as they were called back then, in legislature and other things, which is what we call reservations today.
Right.
So I wrote an article, I think 1 or 2 years back, in which I wrote there are 3 strands of Hindu nationalism. One is the Ratnagiri line, which is the Savarkar's radical Hindutva. The second is Nagpur line, which agrees to Hindutva, but say, let's go slowly because we can't force people to change. And then you have the social orthodoxy like Ram Rajya Parishad and so on. So we have discussed social orthodoxy and the Ratnagiri line. They're completely opposed to each other. What is the relation between Ratnagiri line and the Nagpur line?
Well, I think what you said rightly, Savarkar being very much of a nihilist, and I think a man in a hurry who was trying to dismantle everything. I mean, removing superstitions, which he thought were superstitions, removing rituals, this whole, his views on cow worship and all of that, which I think are well known now. And I don't need to repeat that. But then his very, very radical, earth-shattering thoughts about all of this, obviously the what you call the Nagpur line would not agree with this kind of, while they stood for reforms, while they stood for progressive measures in society, I think it needed to be done step by step. And Indian society is not ready to take so much of, or probably any society for that matter, is not ready to take up so much of earth-shattering reforms when the evils have been entrenched for so many generations. So I think there he also failed as a leader to kind of build that mass base, because he was never a mass leader of the kind of Gandhi was, because these thoughts would never be acceptable to people. So in fact, that's one reason why even after he came out of Ratnagiri and he took up the Hindu Mahasabha, one, of course, the Congress was against him all the time, including when he went on his processions and rallies. There were so many attempts made by peace-loving, non-violent congressmen on his life, which I document in the book, where he was almost lost his life several times because there were murderous attacks done on him. But another set of people who did this were also the orthodox elements of the society who hated his social reform program. And so they had this axe to grind against him all through. So I think there he erred, where he didn't take this mid path. And the results are there for us to see. I mean, while the Hindu Mahasabha petered out and almost came to a point of decline, the Sangh just grew in strength ever since. And today it is what it is. It's in such a dominant position in social, cultural, political arena of India.
Yes. So my second last question to you, Vikram, is about his view of the women, because we often hear that he was a supporter and advocate of sexual violence against the women and so on. So what was his vision of the Hindu women, and also, let's say, his opinion on gender and other things?
Yeah. I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, or what it is, he didn't write too much about what he thought of women as a whole. There was always this ideal of a woman, again drawing from Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj's life of Jijabai, the brave woman who gives birth to sons again who are going to be protectors of the nation. So these kind of references come about several times in his writings. But then to address the other point that you raised about whether he advocated rape as a tool and all of that, which is constantly held. And I think the reference to that comes to that 6 Golden Epochs, the last book that he wrote in his life. Again, that's another folly with Savarkar, where I call him an amateur historian, where his research was immense, intense research he would do for several years. But the way the coldness that history demands as a discipline, you can't get into a flourish. But Savarkar was basically a poet at heart. He was a romantic poet. So this profuse language and the bhav mein beh jana, what we say, I mean, that comes about repeatedly in his writings, which is why I think they may not stand the test of scholastic historiography. So in such a scenario, I think he'd written this in the context of, when he mentioned that Hindu warriors of the past, they stuck to all the ethics and morality of Yuddha Dharma. What are the rules of war? We are not going to strike after sunset. We are not going to kill, nihatte pe war nahi karenge. We are not going to attack women, children, all of this. But that was okay during the times of the Mahabharata, where both sides were probably agreeing to these unwritten code of conduct. But with the invasions of the Arabs or the Turks and the Mongols and all of that, none of whom believed in these ethics of war. It was a one-sided display of ethical conduct in war, which was not reciprocated by the other side. So as a result, while even if we showed these magnanimity, we have all these instances where the enemy was almost brought to their knees, but then with a magnanimous, gesture, the Hindu side would say, "Chalo, maaf kar diya," or it's become evening, or you don't have nihatte ho to tumko chhod dete hain, whatever. And that cost the nation so much, that cost future generations so much, because the other side did not compliment you for these ethics. They actually thought of it as cowardice. So, and made use of it against you. So he said, for once, if even people like Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj or Chimaji Appa and others who had very, very, very honorably let these women back to the other side who were captured, did they even think once of the millions of Hindu women whose modesty was outraged during those centuries of invasion? And he says there in a hypothetical kind of way, that if we had also reciprocated in the same manner, the way they plunder our places of worship or they desecrate the modesty of our women, if even once we had done the same to them and instilled that fear of doing such barbaric acts, then they would not have dared to do this ever again. And so the history of this country, or the history of the manner in which the people of this country were treated, particularly women, children, or the important places of worship, that would have been very different. But we were showing magnanimity to barbarians who did not deserve to be shown. So that is what he meant. He did not mean this as a prescriptive tool for the present or the future. It was always in the past. Had they done this, then this could have happened. Now, but the way that whole thing is constructed, as I said, in a very, very politically incorrect, totally, that people can turn it in any way and say he's actually advocating his followers of today to go and rape anybody who does not belong to his faith, which was not true at all.
But you're right that Savarkar always advocated that women should be politically aware. They should learn, martial arts. They should be physically strong and educated and so on. So, and this is in 40s and the 30s when such views were not as acceptable as they are today. So in that way, he had a forward-looking view, which basically, which is basically his entire view of, I said, argument for a Hindu modernity.
Yeah, and as early as the 1890s and the early 1900s, as a college student, he wrote these poems on widow remarriage, and he wondered, why should a woman, shave off her head and lead her whole life in misery after the husband dies, but the husband can get married within a couple of days after his wife dies. How fair is this? And these poems actually won him several awards in poetry competition, in elocution competition. So this, gender equality was also something that seems to have been instilled in him right as a school and college student. Again, a fact that we don't give him credit for.
So coming to the last question, see, he was not a mass leader. He was a thought leader, basically.
Yeah.
What was what were his end years of life like? Was he disillusioned? Was he, full of hope that things will change? Because when he died, the Congress was the hegemon, and it looked like that the things are not going the right way.
Correct. Yeah, I think one is independence. With independence came Mahatma Gandhi's murder, his Savarkar's trial, and he remained in jail for 1 year. He was acquitted in 1949 of the Red Fort trial, but then somehow the people kept using that. In fact, even Nehru in the election rallies of 1951, the first ever election, would always bring up the fact that the RSS, the Hindu Mahasabha, Savarkar were the assassins of Gandhi, and so on. When just then the court had acquitted all of them, including the RSS, was actually, whether it was the court or the Kapoor Commission, particularly the RSS, was completely absolved of any involvement with the murder. But that was repeated then time and again. 1950, when the Liaquat-Nehru Pact was being signed, there was a huge, crackdown of any political opposition. Savarkar and thousands of other Hindu Mahasabha and RSS and Hindu organizations members were all put in jail for no reason under the Preventive Detention Act, saying that they were asking for a dismemberment of Pakistan, and that was actually anti-national to even say that. And so most of them spent several years in jail, and he was released on the terms that he is not going to talk about politics for a couple of years till the elections are over. So till the elections are over, all political opponents are not allowed to talk politics, so that the main hegemonic power can win the elections also very easily with no opposition to counter it. So after that, once those strictures were taken away, time and again, I've mentioned in the book also the manner in which he was cautioning the government, particularly on its policies related to China. And how China is not a country that can be trusted upon. We should not get so, overboard with this Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai and Panchsheel and all of that. The way China invaded Tibet and took it over, and at that time, India did not even do a thing. India actually supported China's, admission into the Security Council in the UN. All of this he had flagged off in the Kesari in his articles, which again I quote in the book, saying, he was being constantly that vanguard. He was warning against the increasing conversion in the northeastern states and how that demographic change could lead to national security issues, something that we actually saw later in the several decades later of insurgency and so on. So he was being this vanguard for national security, national sovereignty, but time and again also saying that, let us now not be confrontationist with the government. Let us be conciliatory, because this is no longer a foreign power. It is our own Indians who are leading. They may have their flaws, but let's try to strengthen their hands. But then Nehru seemed to have a terrible antipathy for him, so much so, Abhinav, that in 1957, when the 100th year of the 1857 war was actually being commemorated in New Delhi, a group of people wanted to also have a function, a public event where Savarkar and other people, who were still there, revolutionaries, could be felicitated in a public meeting in Delhi, presided by the Prime Minister, Nehru. So when they go and actually ask Nehru's consent to be a part of it, he says, if Savarkar is there, I'm not going to participate, because, I don't, his 1857 book is of course excellent, but I do not approve of it. And so it will be embarrassing for both me and him to share stage. Maybe you can have it with him and I'll come on a later date. And this was again,
Savarkar was the first person to call it the
first war of Indian independence.
And this is how Nehru treated. But this is how Nehru government treated Ambedkar as well. When they organized the first international Buddhist conference.
Correct.
So they also sidelined him. He's not invited.
True, true. So in fact, yeah. Luckily, that committee decided to drop the Prime Minister of India, but invited Savarkar, and he was part of that centenary celebrations. Whoever, Bhagat Singh's family, so many others who were still around then of the revolutionary movement, they were all invited and had a huge public gathering. So, but then, yeah, he was disillusioned increasingly, and someone like him, who was, I think, this running feud with Nehru was so palpable that whoever be it, when Sardar Patel died or when Shama Prasad Mukherjee, his protege, who had of course broken away from him and the Mahasabha and formed the Jansangh, when he died, Savarkar would always give out, and when Gandhiji died also, he gave out these obituary messages and condolences in public. It was only when Nehru died, he remained silent. There was not a word, whisper of condolence. And that was, I think, the level of animosity between the two men. And 2 years later, of course, 1966, he decided, he didn't die a natural death even. He decided to end his life, by abstaining from food and water and medicines in that Jain tradition.
It's called something samsara or what? No.
Yeah, there's some...
Not samsara, something else, yeah.
Yeah, something from P. So
it's a completely different concept. Yeah, sorry.
Correct. So yeah, he actually did that and gave up everything. He wrote a big piece also on that, saying it's not Atmahatya but Atmahuti. I have outlived I've done everything for my motherland. I have karz utar diya hai maa ka. So now there is no point staying. And his wife also died around 1 or 2 years before that. Of course, even then he refuses. He initially refused permission to even perform her Shraddh, saying, I don't believe in these rituals. Chitpavan Brahmin saying that. A lot of members of his family come and tell him that, don't do this. But then he says, I don't believe in this, so I will not give permission. But the son later says, she's my mother. I am the one who's supposed to do it. You are nobody to seek permission from. And so he says, you do what you want. I'm not going to, force my views on you, but I'm not going to participate even in the Shraddh ceremonies. And for his own death, he put out a will saying no usage of sandalwood and waste of all of this. You're using an electric crematorium. Those days, it was still considered anti-ritual to use an electric crematorium. No long processions, no disruption of public life because of my death, and no Shraddh ceremonies. You're just going.
The guy should be the liberal hero.
Exactly. He's the ultimate epitome of liberalism, if at all one cared to read him, Abhinav. And that's the only thing, without reading, without the knowledge of anything that he stood for or said, he just go on putting so many labels and then reinforcing that every now and then through half-baked information, that it almost becomes an axiom that he was all the bad things that he is usually stated out as.
Wonderful anecdotes, Vikram, and it was a great time talking to you. I wish we had more time so that we could discuss it more, but thanks a lot for your time, and thanks a lot for writing this book. People, please read this book no matter what you do.
Yeah, thank you, Abhinav. And I'm so glad that we had a conversation on a range of topics that generally interviewers don't ask me about. The minute it starts, "Par usne to maafi nama likha tha." So I'm like, oh my God, I've explained this ad infinitum. Please go and see some other video. So thank you. Only you could, bring out questions which are so interesting and unique. Thank you.
And thank you, audience, for listening to us. Please subscribe to the channel. Yes, Urban Chatterati will continue. Frequency might be a bit low given my other responsibilities, but we will continue this discussion with people like Vikram and on a range of topics. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.